Hello, welcome to Needle and Hearth, where we cultivate the lost arts. Today I am working on a ruffled petticoat to go over my corded petticoat. Like my corded petticoat, this one will also be adjustable. This is what the final should look like. The pieces I used was waistband, an underskirt that all the ruffles attached to, 4 layers of ruffles, and then the draw cord tubing. Once I had all of my measurements, I did my favorite thing, ripping my fabric. So I originally wanted 5 layers of ruffles, about 7.5 inches finished, but when I was going through my stash trying to find fabric for this project, I found this beautiful bed skirt that I've had kicking around for quite a while and decided this would be the perfect opportunity to use it. The bed skirt was about 13 inches before finishing, but it would still be close to 13 inches finished. And that was going to be way too long, especially if I kept all the ruffles at 7.5, or the ruffles would overlap way too much and probably just get bulky instead of fluffy. So I decided to make all the ruffles get slowly skinnier as you head towards the waist. Everything but the bed skirt got a simple basic seam. The waistband got a basic seam because the raw edges would be enclosed in the waistband. The ruffles and the skirt itself was salvage to salvage, so I wouldn't have to worry about the seams unraveling over time. So you'll see me running these long strips of fabric through my hands. That's to catch any twists and turns that the fabric might want to do. If you don't catch them and you put your ends together, it will be twisted on the final, and you can't really have a twisted ruffle. So the reason why you would want a ruffled petticoat over, like, say, the corded petticoat, or these would even go over hoop skirts, is it helps smooth out the lines. You could probably have seen it in my last video where you could sort of see the outline of the corded petticoat, and I've definitely noticed it more and more as I'm wearing it out and about, that you can see the corded petticoat underneath through my skirt. So this ruffled petticoat will add extra volume on top of it, but also just smooth out the lines, and it just makes it look so much prettier. Here I'm just trying to show that there is a front and the back. It's very hard to see on the camera, but when you're in person you can see what is technically the back side of the stitching. For the former bedsheet, I did not have selvage edges. I had raw edges. So to prevent it from fraying over time, I did French seams, which is wrong sides together, stitch, turn it around so your right side's together, then you stitch next to your first stitching. It encases your raw edges and prevents it from fraying in the future. Whee! So long. As you can see here, I didn't do too good of a job of making sure my raw edges were inside my second stitch line, so I have a little bit of scraggly ends, but with some time and trimming, I can fix that. So to finish all the ruffles, not the bed skirt, I did a narrow rolled hem. I had to pull out my home machine for the attachment. I don't have an attachment for my industrial machine, so home machine it was. Please excuse my farmer's manicure in these next segments. You can very clearly see it. I was putting my garden to bed for the winter, and then my cats decided to get really feisty right before I started filming. I suggest finding a really good movie or a podcast to listen to, because doing the math, I ended up with about 40 yards of ruffles, and that's a lot of hemming. You're going to be there for a while. And it can be a little bit putsy if you happen to just let go of the fabric at the wrong moment. You will not get a rolled hem, you'll just get a top stitched edge. So yeah, sit down, get comfortable, and just chug along. Once I finished my 40 yards of ruffle hemming, I got started on the drawstring binding. I pulled out my trusty binding maker and ran my pre-cut strips of fabric through it. I used my seam ripper to help me draw the strips of fabric through, and then came after it with my iron to keep everything nice and crisp. While I had my iron out, I decided to press my waistband and get that done and over with. I folded all the raw edges of the waistband into the center of the waistband, creating 3 folds for the waistband. The waistband side seam, I pressed it open before I started pressing the 3 fold of the waistband. Like my corded petticoat, this petticoat will also be a drawstring. The waistband is much skinnier than the corded petticoat because it is much lighter, and the waistband does not need to be as sturdy. I wanted these grommets a little bit closer to the top folded edge of the waistband. I wanted more space on the bottom for my machine foot to get through for the stitching later. So after I marked where I wanted all my grommets, I went and punched a hole and then used my grommet setter to get the grommets in. You have your little metal disc that goes on the bottom. Then you take the shaft side of the grommet, set it on the metal disc, shaft pointed up. Then you put the fabric over the shaft, and then you take the flat side of your grommet, put that over your shaft, and then take your top centerpiece and you insert it through all the holes, and then you take your rubber mallet or a plastic hammer. In this case, do not use a metal hammer. It will damage the steel of your grommet setter, and these buggers can get spendy, so you don't want to do that. And just pound away until your grommet is set. Before I ruffled anything, I put on the draw cord binding strips. I had 8 strips that I evenly placed about the skirt. I started at the hem, though later discovered I did not need to start at the hem. I probably should have just started much closer to where the lower hem ruffle will be attached. I will show that later. And then, as straight as I could, I went all the way up to the waistband, but then marked 2 inches down from the waistband. The 2 inches was just an arbitrary number. I didn't want the binding strip to go all the way to the waistband. I wanted a little bit of a gap. Just thought it would lay better and look nicer, and then also just be easier to draw the cord. And 2 inches was just a nice even number for in my head, and then also for measuring. After getting all 8 of the drawstring binding pinned into place, I then went and top stitched. Each of the binding strips will get 3 stitches, one along each of the folded edges and then one down the center, creating 2 tubes that the ribbon, string, whatever will go through. I have this foot that's meant for doing edge stitching. It has this extra little toe that you run along either a folded edge, an extra stitch line, or even your raw edge, and it keeps you at the perfect distance from whatever you are stitching next to. I started stitching down from the waistband, and once I came down to the hem, I turned the whole entire garment around and started stitching on the other side of the binding, stitching up to the waistband. Then once I got to the top again, I turned it back around and then stitched down the middle again. And I just kept repeating this for 8 times. As you can see, this thing is already starting to get a little unwieldy, and we haven't even added ruffles yet. To even add the ruffles, first we need to ruffle the ruffles. I took each of the ruffles and marked them on 8 even spacings to correspond with the 8 draw cord bindings, and then I ruffled in between each of the markings. I tried different types of ruffling things. I had even tried doing on my machine running 2 threads through the needles and 2 threads through the bobbin, but that did not work out at all. So I am back to hand stitching all 40 yards of ruffles. And yes, that is as tedious as it sounds, and so I just got myself a comfortable chair, a good movie. This time it was Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, and just had fun with it. Before even putting on the ruffles, I needed to know where I was putting the ruffles. So I started with the hem and made a mark for the first layer of ruffles. And then from that marking, I just kept measuring up and up for each layer of ruffles, measuring off of the last one. Each of the markings was not where the stitch line would be, but where the raw edge of the ruffle would be. To place the ruffles, you will have right sides together. The ruffle will be facing towards the waistband, and you will pin between each of the drawstring bindings, not actually on the drawstring bindings. If I had actually thought ahead, I would have left a gap for each of the bindings, but I didn't, so I have to pick out a little bit of each of the ruffling to make room for the bindings, because we want to leave where the bindings is empty so the drawstring can go through and be unencumbered and not caught by stitching. So each of the ruffles are being ruffled to in between the bindings, so all the ruffle is contained in those 8 segments. The best way I found was to pin each end of the ruffle segments to in between the bindings and grab the tail of my ruffle string and just pull on it and ruffle the ruffle fabric down to fit between each segment. I'm not sure if it was the best idea to go and pin every single ruffle on before I stitched. It might have been slightly better to do a ruffle, stitch, do the next one, and so on. But I don't like going back and forth between things, so I thought I would just sit there, pin everything down, get it good, and then go over to my machine, and then essentially I would be done with all the ruffles in one go. To stitch on each ruffle, I chose a 1/2 inch seam allowance, just make it sturdier. Definitely was not perfect on that 1/2 inch, but who really cares? When stitching, I started right at one of my bindings and then went down to the next one and stopped, cut my thread, and then jumped over the binding and started again on the other side. You do not want stitching on the binding. If you stitch on the binding, the draw cord will not work. You have just closed your draw cord tube. As you can see, it probably would have been better to do the pin one ruffle, sew it, do the next one. But since I didn't do that, you can see me struggling. It is very bulky. There's also a lot of pins. I ended up stabbing myself pretty good. Got some really great blood spots on my petticoat. Hey, did you know that your own saliva will actually dissolve your blood? So if you get blood on your clothes, you could just spit on it. So I forgot a step of serging the raw edge of my ruffle, and then I really wanted to be lazy and only do one stitch for each ruffle to hold it on. But my grandmother convinced me that this was not the correct course and I should do a top stitch on to have two stitches holding my ruffle on. And well, grandmother's always right. Listen to your grandmother. And again, not stitching on the binding. To get the waistband on, first I gathered the skirt to fit the waistband, and then I unfolded the waistband from my trifold and pinned it to the inside of the skirt and stitched following the first fold line on my waistband. And once I finished stitching, I folded it all back up and had the skirt inside the waistband. And then I went through and top stitched through all the layers of the waistband and the skirt. Now that the stitching is all done, it is now time to add all the drawstrings or draw cords. I started with the draw cords for the length adjustments. As you can see, on each of the ruffles, I left a gap over the binding, so my binding will not be closed off by the stitching. To add my drawstring, or in this case draw ribbon, I use this really fat tapestry needle. It has also been called a doll needle. It has a nice fat head to get my ribbon through, and it's also fat enough where you can feel it wherever you shove it inside your garment, so it's very easy to manipulate when you're trying to draw something through. I started at the waistband and shoved the needle on through, dragging the ribbon with it, and went all the way down to the hem. And then once I get to the hem, I will draw out what I need for the other side and come back up to the waistband again. As you can see here, I did not actually need to have my binding going down that far. Once the ruffle is there, it's going to cover that up, and there's really no point on having that drawn up. And actually, while I have experimented with it since it's been done, it is really pointless to have that section drawn up. So I could have saved some time and materials. Coming back to the waistband, when I got my ribbon out, I went and evened up the ends and moved on to the next one and repeated this about 8 times. Finishing the length adjusting draw cords, I moved on to the waistband. I didn't have any ribbon that was skinny enough or fat enough for this. Either my ribbons were that tiny purple, which is only an eighth, or I had 1 inch and fatter, which is too fat for my waistband. So I took my 1 inch, folded it in half, and just top stitched down it to keep it folded in half. So it ended up being double thickness ribbon and very sturdy now. I used the same fat tapestry needle to draw it on through and just made sure each end was even. Ooh, look at all that fluff. Oh, I love this petticoat. It definitely is nice and fluffy. It's not going to be as fluffy as a hooped petticoat, but it's still perfect for me. Excuse my adjusting. I was still trying to figure out how to get both the corded petticoat and the ruffled petticoat to work together around my waist. You can really see the difference that this ruffled petticoat makes. The one skirt is just the skirt and the corded petticoat. The other one is the corded, ruffled, and the skirt. Since this petticoat is supposed to go with my corded petticoat, it also adjusts in length, and it adjusts the same way as the corded petticoat. You grab your tails by your waistband, give them a good yank, and just even out the ruching that you are doing. And you're going to do this all the way around. It's probably a little more tedious than the corded petticoat, but again, I think it is still worth it to have one petticoat that will work with my entire wardrobe. One petticoat to rule them all. And as you can see, it even works on the short skirts too.